You're listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House.
Hello, this is Juan de Lara, Cultural Manager at Asia House, and I'm very glad to be back with our second season of Arts in Isolation. Our partners, the Baraka Trust and us, along with our supporters, the Al Tajir Trust and the Juan Trust for Culture, are very pleased to be back after the summer break and ready to bring you some amazing quality content that explores, as usual, the aspects of cultures that comprise the Islamic world. I'm very happy to have with me today for our first episode Salma Tuqan, who is currently the Deputy Director of the Delfina Foundation in London, where she helps strengthening institutional ties and cultural contents for the foundation and ensuring its growth. Salma brings to us today also her expertise over years working for organizations like Art Dubai. She has also been the Artistic Director of Contemporary, and I think one of Salma's most relevant achievements was her role as Contemporary Middle East Curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where she was responsible for the Middle Eastern art and design programming of the museum. She also worked on the Jamil Prize exhibition and co-founded the Culture in Crisis stream. Salma, it's lovely having you here with us today, and I think it is important for our audience to understand your background and why this interest in the Levant region and the Arab world.
Thanks so much, Juan, for having me. I've really enjoyed the podcast series during the lockdown, so I have to thank you and your colleagues and the other organizations involved who are also dear to my heart. In terms of my background, I'm a Palestinian British curator and cultural strategist. Currently, my role is Deputy Director of Delfina Foundation. But I grew up partly in Kuwait. My parents are both Palestinian, and we left to move to London during the Gulf War. Slightly earlier than we anticipated. I think my love for culture really came from my parents, who now currently for the last few years have been living in Beirut and have made their second home, or primary home actually, in Beirut. So this kind of love and appetite for culture has really come from them, and is actually initially it directed me to study that at university. So I think my interest in the region really stemmed from, living far away from the region. In fact, having moved over from Kuwait when we were very young, I think it was partly really trying to understand where I came from and where my roots were. The first time I visited Palestine with my family and my grandparents, who still had a strong connection to the country, was when I was around 12 years old, and it had a big marking on me. So I definitely feel as if the decision to really pursue and try and, study the region really came from trying to understand maybe myself and my ancestry and come closer to it.
So in relation to your interest in Arab contemporary art, how do you think was the transition from the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is a large institution with thousands of workers and staff members, to Delfina Foundation, an organization which fosters new talent and artists in residence?
Yeah, in fact, the transition was was a positive one and very natural, as actually both institutions I've known since I was very young. Well, in the case of the V&A, in fact, it was my childhood museum. So there was something that was very familiar and special and dear to my heart. And with Delfina Foundation, it was a space that I would keep visiting after I graduated from university. So I think there was a familiarity with both organizations. But I was lucky with the V&A in that the position was an inaugural role. So there hadn't existed a contemporary Middle Eastern role within the museum. And I think for that reason, it was a very special challenge in that I joined a department where the rest of my colleagues, who were wonderful, all specialized in Islamic art. So I think trying to reconcile my space within this encyclopedic museum that, specialized in decorative arts, crafts, design, performing arts, and trying to create a space within that for contemporary Arab content was interesting. I'm not sure how many people know, but the Asia department at the V&A, of which Middle East is a subsection, is divided by, it's like fashion, furniture, textile. I think my goal there was really to try and create a place for the region and integrate it within the collection, displays, commissioning opportunities, public program, and general thinking, rather than ghettoizing it on the basis of nationality and race. And that was really coming from many reasons, including the feeling that many practitioners had to be seen on par and just as a global, designer or artist. So over the 8 years that I was there, I tried to create this profile for Arab contemporary content at the museum through relationships. So I was able to work very closely with artists, designers, and architects across the region, and to create, opportunities within that through residencies, new commissions, displays, and also to start the basis of a collection for the institution, and to create opportunities to show that material as well, and create space for it.
So perhaps in order to better understand the region, the cultural sector of the region, you could list a couple of examples from initiatives that you work on at the V&A that illustrates the impact that projects had in the region.
I think it's irrespective. I think the V&A is a huge institution that has that carries a lot of presence. So I think the opportunities that were created within that have had a big effect on some of the artists and designers that we were able to work with. One particular project that comes to mind was with a Palestinian duo who are brothers, in fact, Ilyas and Yusuf Anastas from Bethlehem, who are architects and designers. And the work that we produced together was called While We Wait, and it was looking at the cultural claim of nature in Palestine through many different layers. I think the beauty of the project really was going beyond the region and really thinking about the idea of festivals. This was a commission for the London Design Festival, where a lot of work, a year's work actually, goes into what is essentially 1 week festival. So we tried to create a provocation whereby the object, in fact, makes its way back to the land that inspired it. So with While We Wait, the commission, which resulted in a combination of an architectural intervention as well as a sound piece, a beautiful commissioned essay by Karim Katan, then ended up traveling to Dubai, where many communities of Palestinians are also based, but can't. In fact, many of them can't actually return to Palestine, and finally ended up being sited in the heart of the Crimson Valley, a beautiful green space that has been divided due to the separation wall. So While We Wait as an intervention, in the end, ended up being an offering to nature itself, to the community, and to the landscape. So the projects that we tried to do was really rethinking the role of an institution, creating opportunities. But equally, I would say, I think the effects wasn't just on artists and designers from the region, but was also a learning curve for the institution itself.
So we're discussing a lot about the cultural scene of the Middle East and the Levant in particular, but I think it could be really useful for our audience to get a general overview of the structures of cultural non-for-profits of the region.
Yes, I'm going to talk maybe more about the Levant, which is the region that I know best. Of course, the Gulf and North Africa work slightly differently, and each country has its own dynamics. But I would say, for the most part, government support in countries like Lebanon and Palestine and Syria have been slightly negligible. So the private sector, as a result, is lent on to a large degree. And by the private sector, I'm also talking about the impetus of artists and curators themselves. So you have spaces like Ashkal Alwan, which is a critical space in Beirut, which was actually started post-Civil War in Lebanon, and really was through the work of a series of artists and curators who started working in the public space and have now built a hugely important institution that not only trains young curators, gives studio space, commissions, but much more. There's also, of course, corporate support. However, unlike countries like the US, there's very few tax incentives for people to give. Likewise, there's also been patron schemes, something that's hugely popular in the UK and elsewhere. And there are a few patron schemes in the region, but they tend to be, for the most part, now in Turkey. So there's two schemes that are young patron schemes in Turkey. One that an organization, Saha, organized, and another one that Istanbul Modern does. However, there are a few fantastic examples of private sector support. One of them, which is a real bastion of support, is called the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture, called AFAC. And that's an independent organization which supports practitioners across the whole Arab region in the fields of visual arts, performing arts, cinema, literature, and music. And that does that through grants, training, and mentorship. And what's fantastic about AFAC is that it is entirely transparent. It was set up by a group of cultural enthusiasts and patrons who understood really that there was a real gap in support and how far patronage and philanthropy could go. Another organization which does brilliant work is called Mufradat, which is based out of Brussels. And that creates, again, opportunities for artists from the Arab world, but it also has some very interesting programming, including something called Consortium Commission, where they have managed to get the buy-in from very prestigious institutions across the world who collectively select and finance a new commissions of Arab artists and end up showing it and touring it in each of those venues. They also have, brilliant fellowship programs and also curatorial intensives for budding curators from the Arab world. So I think it's really thinking about longevity. For me, though, one of the most interesting and inspiring examples, because I feel sometimes that we forget how avant-garde the region has been, is an organization that emerged out of Beirut in 1967. And it was called Dar el-Fan. It was founded by a brilliant Lebanese woman called Janine Rubez. This space was really remarkable. And it was set up actually at that point in time as a limited shareholding company, I think with a capital worth of about 50,000 Lebanese pounds, all divided up over 1,000 shares. So you had writers, poets, professors, actors, philosophers who could buy shares. But what was interesting is that no one person could buy more than 10 shares because they were really keen to make sure that no one had undue influence. So this, I think, idea, this business sort of concept of limiting influence, I think, and having, stakeholders, had come in the late 60s. But I mean, this space held debates and exhibitions and poetry competitions and was tackling topics like women's rights in Islam, the relationship between creativity and imitation, gender. It was really ahead of its time. And at that moment in time was also thinking very crucially about archiving and the importance of documentation. So every talk that was held there was published. Unfortunately, the space was closed in 1975 with the outbreak of the civil war in Lebanon. But I think what's important about this is that really the space was way ahead of its time globally and, is inspiring for many organizations that have come in its stead.
It's excellent to hear of historic initiatives like this one, and I wonder how transformative were these organizations for the sector. I guess they acted as dynamos of social change, and I wonder what did the communities learn from these initiatives?
In terms of kind of measuring its impact, I think it had a large impact on civil society. As I was mentioning, many of the talks and events that happened there involved a far larger audience. It was members of civil society, individuals, and citizens across the city. I think that there, as a result, and also certainly, that have come and been inspired, but moreover with their own new ideas. There's some brilliant organizations in the city that are carrying out this idea of a much more horizontal way of approaching things. There's one in Beirut that's called Mansion, which was initiated by an artist, Ghassan Maasri, who, after passing through, as most people know, if they've visited Beirut, there's some incredible buildings that have come from the modernist era, but even before that. So after, spending a lot of time passing this 1930s abandoned villa in Beirut, he became very curious about this and tracked down the owner. The building was unoccupied. And so with the owner's permission, who was very supportive of the arts, he let Ghassan restore the building and regenerate the space to become part of the community. So the space itself actually hosts 10 working studios where residents who all come from different backgrounds. You know, some are dancers, writers, curators, designers, and many others. They all play a hand in contributing time, labor, and money to the ongoing renovation of it, in return for a very small rental fee. The idea is really that, you know, they're giving much of their expertise, and they all contribute to a shared sense of public programming at Mansion. But the space is, what's interesting is that the space is run without external funding as a result. So you have a model that is very similar to a cooperative, and their governance is a horizontal one where all the stakeholders decide together, you know, which other new residents will come in. And it's one where you see there is a real sense of sustainability, especially at a time now when public funding and private funding has dried up, and also when the question of fundraising and keeping spaces afloat has become so precarious.
And Salma, I wonder, why is there a lack of funding in the region?
For several reasons. I think certainly in Beirut, even before the recent, very sad explosion, there many people, because of the economic situation, have left the country. They've been relying, or there's been a reliance on fewer patrons and donors to several organizations. But I think globally there's a moment where most organizations are having to think about resilience in a very profound way, no longer just relying on one or two or a handful of individual patrons, but really thinking about what other income generating possibilities there could be, as well as the idea of a more horizontal way of operating. And certainly with COVID, organizations around the world have been heavily affected. Every source of income has been hit to some degree. But this is an example, Mansion, and there are many others actually, which really thinks beyond that. And I know that before, at some point last year, the group had also started speaking to universities and looking into other abandoned spaces across Beirut to see if this model can be replicated elsewhere. There's other fantastic examples that have come out of COVID. One of them in Bethlehem is called the Radio Al Hara, which was started by, again, a group of 5 friends during lockdown to try and continue the sense of connection and community at a point where everyone was rooted in their own location. So, you know, for the last 6-7 months, they've grown, and they've hosted the most incredible music sets from people, DJs, musicians, and artists all over the world. And that's the sets have also included conversations with poets, economists, politicians, writers, and even folk tales with, you know, one that comes to mind as a Palestinian artist called Jumana Aboud. This is another really interesting and innovative approach that's come out, working with very little, but creating an incredible sense of community and impact.
And in your opinion, what do you think are the key characteristics that come to the fore when it comes to defining or describing the cultural sector of the region?
Certainly resilience is kind of a key word, and perhaps also a sensitive word. I know in the case of Beirut, you know, this case of this constant resilience of the people has also become a source of pain, of course, given the recent incidents. But I would definitely say, you know, ingenuity, creativity, resilience, and the ability to constantly adapt. I think that we've seen that, you know, consistently across the region. Another space I would mention, which no longer exists, but, you know, it was never intended to exist in perpetuity, is called Nile Sunset Annex, that was operating out of Cairo. And there, the group of individuals who set it up, who are all artists, actually set it up understanding that there was a lack of having proper technical services for the installation of exhibitions in the city. And so actually offering their services as technicians would then end up generating money to actually propel the space itself. So I think that there's constantly been this idea of adapting and really understanding, being responsive to what the cities need. What I would say is that, you know, there are a lot of projects that have been set up tackling issues around the environment, which have become increasingly important over the last 6 months, or not to say that they weren't important before, but I think globally people recognize why we're in the moment that we're in. And it largely is to do with the abuse that we've been we've exposed our planet to. So there've been, many artists and designers who've really tackled, created projects, even long-term projects like the Palestine Heirloom Seed Library, that tackle issues around heritage, ancestry, but also our relationship with the natural environment. Likewise, many other cultural programs that have been tackling social justice, the crisis around housing, and support also for disadvantaged members of society, and the importance of having equity in our community.
So, for example, in the case of Lebanon, and in particular Beirut, the region has been threatened in the last 8 months by COVID and by also the explosion in the harbor of Beirut. What do you think actually resilience means when it comes to reinventing or revamping their cultural sector? Do they actually need international support?
I think on the notion of resilience, like I said, it's somewhat of a painful word, but sometimes there's tended to be an understanding or an idea that the region is always looking first to the West to set precedent. And I think I've always found it to be the opposite, really, that, there's a real need for us to kind of look to where we came from and look to examples like Dar el-Fan, but many others, as a source of inspiration. I think for the most part, we have enough material in front of us and precedent that has been incredibly avant-garde, far more advanced and far more cutting edge. And I think that there's a lot that can be learned from that if we just pay more attention and look around at all of these, small and larger examples that have come before us and that are right in front of us at the moment about adaptation, responsiveness, ingenuity, creativity, and innovation.
So now I really want to hear your thoughts on what do you think is the future of the region in light of the current socio-geopolitical crisis that is going on, not only in the region, but in the whole world?
I think that's a question that globally many people are asking themselves. What I have seen, not just in the Arab world, but certainly, in the applications, the residency applications that I read on a day-to-day basis and in conversations with colleagues and friends, is that I think that the idea of collaboration has now become, for many reasons, a survival mechanism. People are much more open to working with one another, and people are thinking around other forms of exchange, other forms of reciprocity, whether it be an exchange of services that's less transactional. And I think for the most part, this is going to be a moment where the art world really needs to redefine itself and also think about its relationship with wider society. There's much more concern now for questions around mysticism, alternative ways of operating, our relationship with nature and ecology, the politics of care, of course, science and technology, where is that taking us, and indigenous, ways of operating, what's come before us, treating it with far more with much more interest. So I without sort of knowing, I think this is the direction we're going into, where people are, of course, really thinking about, where do you go from here, and how do you create more resilience in how you operate, and create a program that is directly related to people's experiences and which also reflects and responds to pressing issues globally.
Salma, this I think has been a wonderful learning template to better understand the region, and because we're getting to the end of today's podcast, I think it's always a good reminder to think of why is culture important, particularly in moments like now where the crisis of the coronavirus has hijacked so many organizations. We learned that different museums and cultural venues are reducing their staff members. Other venues directly are just closing and shutting down. Why should we remember always to put culture first?
I mean, I think culture has always been a reflection of our society and has always been, in a way, a sort of a life support to create pockets of joy and reflection on the moment that we're in. I think beyond the government, I think it's also up to arts organizations themselves to really take care of their employees at the moment. As we've discussed before, there are so many organizations here in the UK who are cutting jobs left, right, and center. And I think that there's a problem there, because I think they've given priority really to expansion projects of real estate and expanding their own bases more than they have, human capacity. And I think there really needs to be a change there, that there needs to be far more priority and care taken of taking care of their staff, rather than actually thinking about expansion projects and capital campaigns.
Indeed, let's hope that that's going to be the future, and that after this crisis, the sector can come and resurface with a new impetus. And just before we finish today's episode, I'm very curious of learning and knowing what are you currently working on at Delfina, because I know their programming is excellent, and you have just very recently been able to welcome new artists in residence.
We've just reopened after a 6-month hiatus, which is very exciting. So we have 6 international residents and 3 UK-based ones. But funnily enough, I'm also thinking not just about taking care of them and making their, helping develop their thinking while they're in residence, but I'm thinking about the upcoming themes next year, which is collecting as practice. The theme is normally centered around the psychology around collecting and philanthropy, but really the subsection of next year is going to be tackling issues around restitution, decolonization, and what does it really mean to create collections in the UK that are representative of the diverse communities that the UK is composed of. So I'm trying to pull together a program which really works with UK and international organizations to work hand in hand with the residents that we select on really rethinking their collections, rethinking their strategies towards diversity, and even thinking in a much more nuanced way about their role as not owners of these collections, but actually caretakers of these collections.
Well, Salma, I'm very glad that you and the Delfina Foundation are able to be back on track. And I really want to wish you the very best for this new season, and hope that you're able to achieve and accomplish all your objectives, and that the corona does not stop you from it. Thank you so much for being able to walk us today through the nuances and the difficult paths that are laid out in front of us when it comes to the Levant and the region. I think particularly given the current circumstances and what we have seen on the news and TV and so on, it's important to understand it and at least to raise awareness of it. I hope that you and I are able to meet very soon, and that you can come to Asia House at some point. It would be lovely to host you. Thank you very much.
I hope so too, Juan. It's been such a pleasure. I hope we get to see one another very soon. But thank you so much for hosting me today.
And thank you so much also to you, our dear listener, that every season and every week stays with us. Just to remind you that next week we'll have another episode, and we hope to accompany you until the end of the year with the second season of Arts in Isolation. Until next week, I hope I am able to get rid of this cold, and that you all stay safe, stay well, and take care.
You were listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House. For more information, please visit our website, asiahousearts.org.